The storm that rolled over Spoon Island that night seemed determined to swallow Wyndemere whole. Wind clawed at the castle's stone walls, rattling old windows and making the chandeliers tremble. Inside, the atmosphere was no less violent. Britt Westbourne stood in the great room, pulse thrumming in her throat, watching Britt Sidwell as if seeing him for the first time. There had always been something dangerous coiled beneath his polished exterior, but now that danger was out in the open, no longer dressed in charm or businesslike restraint. The echo of a gunshot still seemed to vibrate in her bones, even though the shot had already been fired, even though the damage had been done in another room, a few minutes earlier, to a man who would never stand up again. Dalton had trusted the wrong person. That truth hung in the air like the cordite stench from Sidwell's weapon. One moment he had been a man trying to maneuver within a dangerous alliance, the next, he had been staring down the barrel of Sidwell's gun in his own home, with no courtroom, no negotiation, no appeal. Dalton's betrayal had been discussed in hushed tones for days. The whispers that he had been passing information he was never meant to share, that he was contemplating cutting his own deal, that he might turn what he knew into leverage to save himself. Sidwell, who built his world on control and fear, had listened, weighed his options, and decided that one example was worth more than 1,000 warnings. So he had gone to Dalton, walked into that house with calculated calm, and ended the problem with a single, decisive pull of the trigger. By the time Britt saw Sidwell again at Wyndemere, the deed was already done. He arrived without visible hurry, but there was a sharpness to his movements, a precision that made her skin crawl. His clothes were immaculate, his demeanor almost composed, yet there was a cold shine in his eyes she had never seen before. Britt felt the air shift around him, as if the house itself understood that a line had been crossed. Questions tore through her mind. Why Dalton? Why now? How far was Sidwell really willing to go? But beneath all of them was a simpler, more primitive reaction. Raw, unfiltered fear. It wasn't just the knowledge that a man she had been working alongside was dead. It was the realization that Sidwell had walked straight into Dalton's house, pointed a gun at him, and pulled the trigger like he was stamping out a minor inconvenience. When Britt confronted him, it was not with the righteous indignation of someone certain of her safety. It was with the shaking voice of a woman suddenly aware that the ground beneath her feet was not solid. Sidwell did not attempt to soothe her. He did not erase her fear, he sharpened it, turned it into a tool. Calmly, almost clinically, he made sure she understood the message. This was not a crime of passion, not an accident, not a momentary lapse of reason. This was policy. Dalton's fate was what awaited anyone who dared to undermine him, and Britt was meant to absorb that lesson right down to her marrow. He framed it as inevitability rather than cruelty, as if his violence were simply the logical conclusion to betrayal. In his world, there were no second chances for traitors, only consequences. Britt could feel the threat woven into every syllable. Sidwell did not need to raise his voice or wave the gun around to make his intentions clear. Dalton was gone because he had crossed an invisible line, and Britt was being shown exactly where that line was. She realized, with chilling clarity, that she was not just a colleague or an asset to him, she was a witness. And witnesses, in Sidwell's universe, only stayed alive as long as they remained useful and loyal. Her fear became something larger, a suffocating awareness that one wrong move, one hint of hesitation, could place her in Dalton's position. This was not a private confession of a crime, it was a demonstration. He wanted her to know that he had done it, and he wanted her to understand why. Practical matters followed, as they always did when someone like Sidwell took action. A body could not be allowed to lie where it fell. Dalton's house, once a safe retreat, was now a crime scene waiting to happen. Sidwell contemplated the next steps with the same detached efficiency he had shown when pulling the trigger. Dalton's body would have to be moved, his final position rearranged, the narrative adjusted. An accident, a robbery gone wrong, a disappearance. There were always ways to bend the truth if you had enough money, enough influence, and enough people willing to look the other way. Britt listened, feeling ill as the logistics of erasing Dalton's last moments were laid out like items on a to-do list. Every detail hammered home the same point: Sidwell was in control, and the story of what had truly happened was his to rewrite. But for all of Sidwell's planning, no cover-up was perfect. Somewhere between his calculations and the storm outside Wyndemere, a crack in his carefully constructed facade began to form. The city did not stop moving because Dalton had been shot. Lives continued to intersect in dangerous and unexpected ways. Far from the castle's looming walls, Laura Spencer went about her day, unaware that she was walking toward the kind of horror that would not easily fade from memory. Her path would eventually cross with Dalton's last resting place, and the illusion of control that Sidwell tried to maintain would collide with the messy reality of human shock and grief. When Laura stumbled upon Dalton's body, the world narrowed to a single, frozen moment. The silence of the space was shattered by the echo of her own scream, a raw, instinctive sound that came from somewhere deeper than thought. She did not see strategy or calculation when she looked at him, she saw a man whose life had been violently cut short. The horror in her eyes was unfiltered, untouched by the justifications Sidwell had spun for himself and for Britt. Dalton was no longer the untrustworthy associate or potential liability Sidwell had executed. To Laura, he was simply dead, shot, discarded, and left for someone else to find. Her reaction carried a weight that no tidy cover story could neutralize. Laura was not the type to turn away or to pretend she had seen nothing. Her scream was the first blow against Sidwell's secrecy, her shaking hands reaching for her phone were the second. She did what any decent person would do when confronted with such brutality: she called for help. The police would come, and with them questions Sidwell would rather no one ask. How had Dalton really died? Who had wanted him silenced? Why had his body ended up here, in this particular place, in this particular condition? The answers would not come easily, but the process of seeking them had been set in motion the moment Laura's voice broke the air. Back at Wyndemere, Britt's fear would grow heavier as news of the discovery inevitably spread. Every siren echoing in the distance, every mention of an active investigation, every rumor would remind her of the conversation she had shared with Sidwell. She would understand that Laura's scream had done more than alert the authorities to a dead man. It had disturbed the fragile balance Sidwell believed he could maintain. The body he had hoped to control had become evidence. The cautionary tale he had staged for Britt threatened to evolve into a wider reckoning. Yet even under that rising tension, the message Sidwell had carved into the night remained carved into Britt's conscience. Dalton's death was not just a plot point in some larger scheme. It was a warning, standing between Britt and any thought of defiance. At Wyndemere, with the storm still beating against the windows and the shadows stretching long across the floors, she understood that she was living in a world where loyalty was enforced at gunpoint and where betrayal was punished with finality. Sidwell had created a chilling example, and Laura's terrified discovery had ensured that the consequences of that example would ripple far beyond the walls of Dalton's home. In the days to come, Port Charles would have to confront what had been done. But on that night, in that castle, Britt knew one thing with absolute certainty. The rules had changed, and there was no going back.